There is a moment in the long sweep of human history when civilization first bloomed on European soil, not in the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, not along the predictable floods of the Nile, but on an island in the Mediterranean Crete where something remarkable took shape beneath the golden Aegean sun. Picture, if you will, a palace unlike anything the world had seen before. Not a fortress, not a simple dwelling, but a labyrinth of chambers and corridors, courtyards open to the sky, and walls painted with scenes of extraordinary beauty. Dolphins leap through blue waves. Young athletes vault over charging bulls in displays of courage and grace. Priestesses in elaborate dress perform ceremonies we can glimpse across 4,000 years but never fully understand. This was Knossos. This was the world of the Minoans. The Minoans did not call themselves by that name, of course. That came much later, from archaeologists who named them after the legendary King Minos of Greek myth. But they needed no name from others. They knew who they were. For nearly 1,000 years, they built a civilization of remarkable sophistication. Europe's first. Consider for a moment what they achieved. While much of Europe remained in the Bronze Age, the Minoans constructed palaces with running water, with drainage systems, with storage facilities that could feed thousands. They traded across the Mediterranean, their ships carrying Cretan olive oil and fine pottery to Egypt, to Cyprus, to the Greek mainland. Their artisans created frescoes of astonishing vitality, images of nature and ceremony that still captivate us with their freshness, their sense of life captured in pigment and plaster, but it was their religion that truly set them apart. At the heart of Minoan culture stood a great goddess. We do not know her name. The linear A script the Minoans used remains undeciphered, keeping their deepest secrets. But we see her everywhere in their art, a female figure with serpents, presiding over nature, over life and death, over the mysteries that governed their world. The bull held sacred significance. In the palace courtyards, young men and women bull leapers would grasp the horns of a charging bull and vault over its back, in displays that combined athletics, ritual, and perhaps sacrifice. Modern scholars debate whether this was sport, ceremony, or both. The Minoans themselves would have seen no contradiction. The sacred and the everyday intertwined, as natural as breath. Life on Minoan Crete moved to rhythms we can only partially reconstruct. Priestesses, and they were women, notably conducted ceremonies in sacred caves and mountain shrines. Offerings were made, rituals performed at the turning of seasons, at harvests, at moments when the boundary between human and divine grew thin. The palace at Knossos, with its maze of rooms, may have been more than a residence. It may have been itself a kind of temple, a place where religious and political power merged into one. Then, around 1600 BC, catastrophe struck. The volcanic island of Thera, north of Crete, erupted in one of the most violent explosions in human history. Entire cities were buried in ash. Tsunamis crashed across the Aegean. The Minoan world, though it survived the immediate disaster, never fully recovered. Pirates raided, trade routes disrupted, the great palaces weakened, and from the north came warriors. The Mycenaeans arrived on the Greek mainland not as a unified people, but as tribal groups speaking an early form of Greek. They were Indo-Europeans, part of great migrations that had spread across Europe and Asia, bringing with them horses, chariots, and gods of sky and thunder. These newcomers built differently than the Minoans. Their citadels rose on hilltops, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos fortified with walls of massive stones that later Greeks, seeing them still standing centuries after, believed only the Cyclopes' one-eyed giants could have lifted into place. Even today, walking among these ruins, one feels the weight of those enormous blocks, fitted together without mortar, enduring, The Mycenaean kings lived in these citadels, in great halls called megarons. Here, around hearth fires, warriors feasted while bards sang songs of gods and heroes. This was a society organized for war and glory, where a man's worth was measured in cattle and bronze, in skill with spear and sword. Yet they were not barbarians. They learned from the Minoans. They traded with Egypt and the Near East. They kept detailed records in a script we call Linear B, an early Greek, finally deciphered in the 1950s by Michael Ventris, revealing the bureaucratic heart of palace life: lists of sheep and chariots, inventories of bronze weapons, names of gods who would become Olympian: Zeus, Poseidon, Dionysus. The religion of Mycenaean Greece was already taking the shape it would hold for 1,000 years. Zeus, the sky father, hurler of thunderbolts, chief among gods. Poseidon, the earth-shaker, lord of seas and earthquakes, earthquakes that constantly reminded Greeks of divine power. Hera, Zeus's wife and goddess of marriage. Athena, already patron of crafts and war. Apollo, Artemis. These were the gods the Mycenaeans worshipped at simple altars and in small shrines, making offerings of animals, grain, and wine. But the gods required more than offerings. They required stories, and in the Mycenaean halls, those stories began to crystallize into something enduring. Consider the power of a story told well. Around the fire, as darkness pressed close and flames flickered on bronze-clad walls, a bard would sing. Not reading the written word was for palace accountants. The bard knew his verses by heart. Thousands of lines memorized, embellished, perfected over generations. He sang of Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, who led the Greeks to Troy; of Achilles, greatest of warriors, whose rage nearly destroyed his own people; of Odysseus, the cunning survivor, who spent 10 years fighting at Troy and 10 more years finding his way home. These were not merely entertainments. They were the Greeks defining themselves. What it meant to be a warrior. What it meant to be a king. What honor required. What the gods demanded. These stories, passed from generation to generation, would survive the coming darkness and emerge transformed into the Iliad and the Odyssey poems that would define Greek culture for all time. But first, the darkness had to come. Around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age world collapsed. It did not decline gradually. It fell apart with shocking speed. Mycenaean palaces burned. Trade routes vanished. Writing disappeared. The great kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean, the Hittites, the coastal cities of Syria, fell to invasions, internal collapse, and catastrophes we still do not fully understand. Scholars call them the Sea People's raiders by ship who attacked Egypt, destroyed cities, left Bronze Age civilization in ruins. Greece entered what we call the Dark Ages. Not dark because people were ignorant or cruel, but dark because we know so little about them. Without written records, without grand monuments, 3 centuries of Greek history remain shadowed, barely visible, yet Greeks endured. They always endured. In small villages, in isolated valleys, communities continued. They farmed, they raised animals, they told stories around fires at night, stories of heroes and gods, keeping memories alive even as the great palaces crumbled into ruin. And in this crucible, something essential was forged. The Greeks of the Dark Ages had no unified kingdom, no empire binding them together. What they had was language, stories, gods. When a traveller from Athens met someone from Sparta or Corinth, they spoke dialects of the same tongue. They worshipped Zeus and Athena. They knew the stories of Troy, of Heracles, of the Argonauts. They recognized each other as Hellene's Greeks, distinct from the Barbaroi, the barbarians whose speech sounded like bar, 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 meaningless noise. this shared culture mattered more than politics. A person's first loyalty was to their polis, their city-state, but beyond that, they belonged to something larger, the Greek world, Hellas, not a nation in our modern sense, but a civilization defined by language, religion, and shared memory. The religion that emerged from the Dark Ages was distinctly Greek. The gods dwelt on Mount Olympus, snow-capped and eternal, intervening in human affairs with passion and caprice. They were not all-knowing or all-powerful. They argued, loved, fought, made mistakes. They demanded respect but not groveling submission. A Greek made offerings, followed rituals, but did not necessarily love the gods. One respected them as one respects a powerful neighbor with care and proper courtesy. Temples began to appear, modest at first, then increasingly elaborate, not as places where congregations gathered for worship, but as houses for the gods. The god's statue lived inside, tended by priests. Worshippers gathered outside, at altars where animals were sacrificed. The blood and smoke rose to the heavens. The meat was roasted and shared among the community in sacred feasts that bound people together through ritual and shared consumption. Consider the power of such gatherings. A city's entire population assembling at a temple of Athena or Apollo. Animals led in procession, garlanded and blessed. The priest performing the sacrifice with ancient words. The smell of roasting meat. Hymns sung, wine poured as libation. In these moments, the boundary between human and divine dissolved. The gods were present, accepting the sacrifice, blessing the city. These rituals connected Greeks across time. The same prayers their ancestors spoke, the same festivals celebrated. When Athenians honored Athena at the Panathenaea, they enacted a tradition stretching back beyond memory. When Spartans gathered at Artemis Orthia's shrine, they continued ceremonies their great-grandfathers had performed. Religion was not about personal salvation or belief in our modern sense. It was about maintaining the cosmic order, keeping right relations with divine powers, and binding the community together through shared ritual. As the Dark Ages lifted and the 8th century BC dawned, Greece was emerging from shadow. Small villages were becoming towns. Towns were becoming polis city-states with defined territories, rudimentary governments, and distinct identities. Trade revived. Pottery styles evolved. Iron replaced bronze for tools and weapons. Population increased. And then came the moment that changed everything. Somewhere in Ionia, the Greek cities on Asia Minor's coast, or perhaps on one of the islands dotting the Aegean, a poet, or perhaps several poets, whose works merged over generations into single names, composed verses that would define what it meant to be Greek. Homer, the blind bard of legend, whether he existed as one person or represents a tradition of oral poets, we cannot say with certainty. But the poems attributed to him, the Iliad and the Odyssey, became Greece's cultural scripture, their shared inheritance, the foundation of their civilization. The Iliad tells of rage, the rage of Achilles, the greatest warrior at Troy, who withdraws from battle when insulted by Agamemnon, watching his fellow Greeks die until his beloved companion Patroclus falls, wearing Achilles' own armor. Then Achilles returns to battle in grief and fury, killing Hector, Troy's greatest defender, and defiling his corpse until the gods themselves intervene. It ends not with Troy's fall, but with Hector's funeral enemies granting each other the dignity of proper burial rites. The Odyssey follows clever Odysseus on his decade-long journey home after Troy's fall. He faces monsters, witches, angry gods. He loses all his men. He returns home in disguise to find suitors consuming his wealth and courting his wife Penelope, who has waited 20 years, faithful despite all odds. Odysseus, with his son and a few loyal servants, slaughters the suitors and reclaims his kingdom. These poems contained everything Greeks valued: courage in battle, but also the tragedy of war, loyalty between comrades, respect for enemies, the importance of hospitality. The gods might appear as strangers seeking welcome, cleverness and cunning as virtues alongside strength, the interference of gods in human affairs, the certainty of death, and the desperate reach for glory that might outlast mortality. Philosophers quoted them, playwrights adapted their stories, politicians invoked their examples. To be educated was to know Homer. To be Greek was to share in these stories, and sharing these stories created community across the fragmented Greek world. An Athenian and a Syracusan might be political enemies, might fight wars against each other, but they both knew Achilles' rage, Odysseus's homecoming. They shared cultural bedrock that bound them together more surely than any political alliance. As the 8th century gave way to the 7th, Greeks spread across the Mediterranean in a great wave of colonization, driven by population pressure, political strife, and desire for trade. They founded cities from the Black Sea to Spain, Massalia in southern Gaul, modern Marseille, Syracuse in Sicily, which would grow greater than most cities in Greece proper, Byzantium on the Bosphorus, where Europe and Asia meet, Cyrene in North Africa. These colonies remained Greek, speaking Greek, worshipping Greek gods, maintaining ties with their mother cities while adapting to new lands and peoples. But what held Greeks together across such distances? Not political unity, they remained fiercely independent city-states. Not military alliance, they fought each other as often as they cooperated. What held them together was culture, language, religion, and, critically, shared festivals. In 776 BC, according to traditional reckoning, the Olympic Games began at Olympia in Elis. This was Zeus's sacred sanctuary, marked by his temple and a sacred olive grove. Every 4 years, all Greeks from Sicily to the Black Sea, from southern Italy to Asia Minor, sent athletes to compete. During the Olympic truce, all warfare ceased. Safe passage was guaranteed. For those few weeks, being Greek mattered more than being Athenian or Spartan. Imagine the scene. Thousands gathering from across the Greek world, athletes training, spectators camping in fields, merchants selling food and wine. The stadion race, a sprint the length of the stadium, roughly 200 meters, run naked by the fastest men in Greece. Wrestling, boxing, chariot racing, with wealthy owners competing for glory. The pentathlon combining running, jumping, discus, javelin, and wrestling. Winners received only an olive wreath cut from Zeus's sacred tree, but they returned home to immortal glory. Statues erected in their honor, poems sung celebrating their victory, privileges granted by grateful cities. Olympic victors lived forever in memory, their names recorded, their deeds sung by poets like Pindar, who transformed athletic victory into hymns praising the victor, his family, his city, and the gods who blessed him. Similar festivals arose at other sacred sites. The Pythian Games at Delphi honored Apollo. The Isthmian Games near Corinth honored Poseidon. The Nemean Games honored Zeus. Together, these 4 festivals, the circuit Greeks called the Periodos, defined Greek unity. To compete in them, one had to be Greek, born of Greek parents, free of blood guilt and sacrilege. They were not open to barbarians. These games marked the boundary of Greekness. Delphi held special significance beyond its games. Here, on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, Apollo's oracle spoke through the Pythia. A priestess who entered trance states, perhaps induced by volcanic gases rising through fissures in the rock, and uttered prophecies that priests then interpreted. Kings and commoners alike consulted the oracle before major decisions. Her pronouncements, famously ambiguous, guided Greek history. When Croesus of Lydia asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle replied that if he did, he would destroy a great empire. He attacked. The empire destroyed was his own. The Greeks understood that the gods spoke in riddles. Divine will was not always clear. One consulted oracles, watched for omens, performed proper sacrifices, but in the end, humans had to choose and accept the consequences. The gods might help or hinder, but they did not remove the burden of human decision and responsibility. By the 6th century BC, the polis had become the defining unit of Greek civilization. Not just a city, but a community of citizens, a very specific concept. Citizens were free-born Greek males who owned property, participated in the city's religious festivals, fought in its army, and had the right to vote in its assemblies. Women, while essential to the polis's continuation, did not hold citizenship in this political sense. Neither did slaves, who performed much of the labor that freed citizens for politics and warfare. Neither did metics, foreign residents, who might live in a city for generations, but remained outside its political community. Yet within these limitations, the polis created something revolutionary. The idea that a community could govern itself, that laws should apply equally to all citizens, that political decisions should be made not by a king or priest, but by citizens debating in assembly. This was democracy's first emergence, imperfect, limited, but unprecedented. In Athens, reforms by lawgivers like Solon laid groundwork for democracy. In Sparta, a unique system emerged where two kings ruled alongside a council of elders, with an assembly of citizens that could approve or reject but not debate proposals. In Corinth, in Thebes, in dozens of other polis, different forms of government developed tyrannies, where strong men seized power, oligarchies, where the wealthy few ruled, democracies, where citizens voted. But in all of them, the polis was the fundamental community, the place where one belonged, the entity worth dying for. And Greeks did die for their polis. Regularly, warfare between city-states was endemic. Disputes over borders, over trade, over ancient insults. The Greeks fought each other with disturbing frequency. But they fought as Greeks, with shared understanding of how warfare should be conducted. Armies of citizen soldiers meeting on agreed-upon battlefields. Hoplites, heavily armoured infantry fighting in tight formation. The phalanx clashing in pushing matches where courage and cohesion mattered more than individual skill. Winners erected trophies. Losers were permitted to recover their dead under truce for proper burial. There were rules to Greek warfare, even in its brutality. But the most important battles Greeks would fight were not against each other. As the 6th century ended and the 5th began, a new power was rising in the east. Persia had conquered the Near East, Egypt, and Asia Minor. Greek cities on the Asian coast fell under Persian control, ruled by local tyrants appointed by the Persian king. In 499 BC, these Ionian Greeks rebelled, requesting help from mainland Greece. Athens and Eretria sent a small force. Together, Greek rebels burned Sardis, the Persian provincial capital. Then the revolt collapsed. Persian armies crushed the rebellion. Temples were burned, cities destroyed. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us that when news reached King Darius of Athens' involvement, he ordered a slave to repeat 3 times before dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." Darius would not forget. And the Greeks, mainland Greeks, who had never faced Persian power, were about to learn what it meant to defend their freedom against the greatest empire the world had yet seen. In the crucible of that conflict, Greek identity would crystallize into something clear and enduring, not merely shared language and gods and festivals, but a shared understanding that they were different, that their way of life, their freedom to govern themselves, to speak in assemblies, to live under laws they themselves had made was worth defending against any odds. The Persians were coming, and Greece would never be the same. The Greek fleet gathered in the strait between Salamis and the mainland. 378 triremes, about half of them Athenian. Facing them was the Persian fleet, perhaps 600 ships from Phoenicia, Egypt, Ionia, Cyprus. The Greeks were outnumbered, but had advantages. Their ships were newer, more maneuverable. Their crews were free citizens fighting for their homes, not conscripted subjects. And they had Themistocles. Themistocles understood that fighting in the narrow strait negated Persian numbers. In open water, 600 ships could surround and overwhelm a smaller fleet. But in a narrow channel, only a limited number of ships could engage at once. Persian numerical superiority became a liability as ships crowded together, colliding, fouling each other. The challenge was getting the Persians to fight there. Xerxes could wait, forcing the Greeks to scatter for supplies or land troops to cut them off. Themistocles solved this with a ruse. He sent a slave to Xerxes with a secret message. The Greeks were planning to flee during the night, escaping to the Peloponnese. If Xerxes wanted to destroy the fleet, he must attack immediately and block their escape routes. Xerxes believed it. Perhaps he wanted to believe it. He sent ships to block the western exit while the main fleet prepared to enter the strait at dawn. The Greek commanders, learning that Persian ships now blocked their retreat, panicked. Some accused Themistocles of trapping them, but Themistocles remained calm. "We are now in exactly the position we want to be in," he said. The Persians had committed to fighting in the strait. Victory was possible. Xerxes set up a throne on the mountainside, overlooking the strait, preparing to watch his fleet destroy the Greeks. Instead, he witnessed his fleet's destruction. At dawn, the Persian fleet entered the strait in multiple columns. The Greeks, formed in line, initially backed their ships, drawing the Persians deeper into the narrows. Then, at a signal, they attacked. Triremes, bronze-sheathed rams at their prows rode at ramming speed, striking Persian ships amidships, splintering hulls, sending ships to the bottom. The strait became chaos. Persian ships, unable to maneuver in the confined space, collided with each other. Greek ships, smaller and more agile, darted between them, ramming, backing off, ramming again. Persian sailors, many of whom could not swim, drowned by thousands when their ships sank. Greeks, all trained swimmers, could reach shore even if their ships were destroyed. The battle lasted all day. By evening, the Persian fleet was shattered. Perhaps 200 Persian ships lost against 40 Greek. Xerxes, watching from his throne, saw his navy the instrument that would have allowed him to supply his massive army and control the seas destroyed by free citizens who refused to submit. That night, Xerxes held council. Without naval superiority, he could not control the Aegean. Without controlling the Aegean, he could not supply his army in Greece. The Hellespont bridges, his route back to Asia, were vulnerable. He decided to withdraw with most of his army, leaving his general Mardonius with perhaps 50,000 troops to continue the war. Salamis changed everything. Xerxes' personal prestige was damaged. Greek morale soared. The impossible had happened twice, Marathon, now Salamis. The gods, it seemed, favored Greek freedom. The following year, 479 BC, the Spartans finally committed their full land power. At Plataea, the combined Greek army, perhaps 40,000 hoplites, faced Mardonius. The battle was hard fought, the outcome uncertain until the Spartan phalanx smashed through Persian lines. Mardonius fell in the fighting. His army broke and fled. On the same day, according to tradition, the Greek fleet destroyed the remnant of the Persian navy at Mycale, on the Asia Minor coast. The Persian wars were effectively over. Xerxes would never return to Greece. No Persian army would threaten the mainland again. The Poleis, through courage and unity they had not known they possessed, had defended their freedom against overwhelming odds. Consider what this meant to Greek self-understanding. Before the Persian Wars, Greeks quarreled constantly, fought each other, doubted whether their small polis could survive. After the wars, they knew they were different, not just different from Persians, but superior in ways that mattered. Persian subjects fought because they were forced. Greeks fought because they chose to. Persian despotism, however wealthy and powerful, could not match the motivation of free citizens defending home and family. The victory celebrations were extraordinary. Athens dedicated a tenth of the spoils to Apollo at Delphi. Monuments rose across Greece commemorating the battles. The playwright Aeschylus, who fought at Marathon and probably Salamis, wrote The Persians, the oldest surviving Greek tragedy, presenting the war from the Persian perspective, showing even enemies as human, capable of suffering, defeated not just by Greek arms but by their own hubris, their overconfidence that led them to violate natural limits. Thermopylae especially became legend. The 300 Spartans who died rather than retreat embodied Greek values perfectly. Not blind obedience, but obedience to law nomoi, the customs and laws that defined civilized life. The Spartans could have fled. They chose to stay. That choice, that willing sacrifice for principle, inspired all. Greece. The Persian Wars became the defining narrative of Greek identity. They proved that freedom mattered more than power, that citizen soldiers could defeat professional armies, that small states united by shared culture could resist imperial conquest. Every Greek child learned of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis. These battles became the measure against which all other conflicts were judged. But victory brought new challenges. The Greek polis had united against Persia. Now, with the threat removed, old rivalries resurfaced. Athens, which had sacrificed most, its city burned twice, its population evacuated, its fleet bearing the greatest burden, emerged as the natural leader of continued resistance. The Delian League, an alliance of polis contributing ships or money for common defense, formed with Athens as hegemon leader. This league would gradually transform into an Athenian empire. The city that defended Greek freedom would become an imperial power itself, ruling subject states with increasing harshness. The unity forged at Salamis would fracture, and Greece, having defeated external tyranny, would turn its weapons on itself in wars that would prove far more destructive than anything Persia could inflict. But that was still to come. For now, in the years immediately after Plataea, Greece basked in glory. They had met the test. They had defended not just territory, but civilization itself. And in doing so, they had proven that their way of life, the polis, the assembly, the freedom to govern oneself, was worth any sacrifice, any cost, any price. They had shown the world what free men could achieve, and the world would never forget. There are moments in human history when everything comes together, when military success, economic prosperity, political confidence, and creative genius converge to produce something unprecedented. For Athens, in the half-century following the Persian Wars, this convergence created what many consider humanity's most remarkable cultural flowering. Not perfect, certainly, not equal or just by modern standards, but within its limitations, 5th century Athens achieved heights of art, philosophy, drama, and architecture that have echoed through millennia. Picture Athens in 440 BC, a city of perhaps 250,000 souls, citizens, women, children, metics, resident foreigners and slaves. Not large by modern standards, smaller than many contemporary cities. Yet from this modest population emerged a culture that would shape Western civilization for 2,500 years. The heart of the city was the Acropolis, the high rock dominating Athens's skyline. Before the Persian Wars, It had been crowned with archaic temples. The Persians burned them in 480 BC. Now, under Pericles' leadership, Athens was rebuilding not just temples, but a monument to human achievement, a statement in marble and bronze declaring what free citizens could create. The Parthenon rose on the Acropolis between 447 and 432 BC, not merely a temple to Athena, but an architectural masterpiece embodying mathematical perfection. Every line was carefully calculated. The columns appeared straight, but were actually slightly curved in tasis, the subtle swelling that made them seem organic, alive. The horizontal lines appeared level, but actually rose slightly in the center to correct optical illusions. Nothing was accidental. Every measurement, every curve, every placement of stone was designed to create visual perfection. Consider the precision required. The marble blocks were cut in distant quarries, transported miles to Athens, hauled up the steep Acropolis slopes, then fitted together so precisely that mortar was unnecessary. Iron clamps held the blocks, but the joints between stones were so tight that even a knife blade could not slip between them. This was not merely engineering, this was sculpture at architectural scale. The temple's decoration told stories. The pediments, the triangular gables at each end, showed Athena's birth from Zeus's head and her contest with Poseidon for Athens's patronage. The metope's square panels around the building's exterior depicted gods fighting giants, Greeks battling Amazons, Lapiths defeating centaurs, civilized order triumphing over chaos. And the frieze, running around the interior walls, showed the Panathenaic procession, Athens' entire population. Citizens and metics, men and women, young and old, processing to honor their patron goddess. Inside stood Phidias's great statue of Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin, 12 meters tall, constructed of gold and ivory chrysolephantine, the most expensive and prestigious sculptural technique. Her shield rested beside her, her helmet crowned her head, her right hand held a small statue of Nike, goddess of victory. The gold alone weighed perhaps a ton. When sunlight through the eastern door illuminated her, the effect must have been overwhelming. Divine presence made visible, the goddess herself dwelling among her people. The Parthenon was only the most famous building on the Acropolis. The Propylaea, the monumental gateway, greeted visitors with columned halls. The Temple of Athena, Nike Athena Victory, commemorated Greek triumph over Persia. The Erechtheion, with its famous caryatid porch where marble maidens served as columns, honored both Athena and Poseidon at the sacred spots where, according to myth, they had competed for Athens. But Athens' cultural achievement extended far beyond architecture. At the southern slope of the Acropolis lay the Theatre of Dionysus, carved into the hillside, capable of seating perhaps 15,000 people, more than half of Athens' male citizens. Here, during the annual City Dionysia festival, the greatest dramatic works in human history were first performed. Greek drama emerged from religious ritual hymns to Dionysus, god of wine, fertility, and divine madness. But by the 5th century, it had evolved into something profound. A public forum where the city collectively examined the most difficult questions of human existence. What is justice? What do we owe the gods? How should we respond to suffering? What happens when duty conflicts with conscience? Tragedy tragoedia, literally goat song, perhaps from animal sacrifices at early performances, presented myths and legends in ways that made audiences confront uncomfortable truths. The playwright did not preach or teach directly. He showed. He created characters in impossible situations and let their choices reveal the complexity of moral life. Aeschylus, who fought at Marathon and Salamis, wrote tragedies that grappled with divine justice and human responsibility. His Oresteia trilogy, the only complete tragic trilogy that survives, follows the House of Atreus, through cycles of murder and revenge, until finally, in Athens itself, the cycle breaks. The Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance, are transformed into Eumenides' kindly ones and incorporated into Athens's legal system. The message was clear. Civilization means replacing blood vengeance with law, replacing endless cycles of retaliation with courts and justice. Sophocles, whose career spanned most of the 5th century, explored fate and free will, duty and desire, the limits of human knowledge. His Oedipus Rex remains perhaps the most perfect tragedy ever written. Oedipus, king of Thebes, learns that he has unknowingly killed his father and married his mother, fulfilling a prophecy he desperately tried to avoid. His investigation of a plague leads him to the terrible truth. When he learns it, he blinds himself and goes into exile. The play asks, is Oedipus guilty if he acted in ignorance? Can we ever escape fate? How should we respond when we discover we have done terrible things despite our best intentions? These are not comfortable questions. Sophocles provides no easy answers, but asking the questions publicly. As a community, 15,000 citizens gathered in Dionysus's theatre created shared examination of life's hardest problems. Democracy required such examination. Citizens who voted on war and peace, life and death, needed to think deeply about justice, responsibility, and the consequences of decisions. Euripides, the youngest of the 3 great tragedians, pushed boundaries even further. His plays questioned traditional values, showed gods as petty and cruel, portrayed women as complex human beings rather than idealized figures. His Medea shocked audiences by presenting a foreign woman who murders her own children to punish her unfaithful husband. Is she a monster? A victim of betrayal driven to extremes? Euripides refuses simple judgment, forcing audiences to grapple with ambiguity. Not all drama was tragic. Comedy Komoidia, perhaps from Komos, a festive procession, provided cathartic laughter and sharp political satire. Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, mocked everyone: politicians, philosophers, playwrights, even the gods. His clouds satirized Socrates and the sophists. His Lysistrata showed women ending the Peloponnesian War by refusing sex until their husbands made peace. His Birds depicted 2 Athenians building a city in the sky to escape Athens's problems. Comedy's function was different than tragedy, but equally important. It deflated pretension, mocked the powerful, allowed ordinary citizens to laugh at their leaders. In democracies where citizens ruled, such satire was essential, a check on arrogance, a reminder that leaders were merely human, accountable to the people they served. These dramatic festivals were not entertainment in our modern sense, not leisure activities separate from civic life. They were civic life. The state paid for the productions. Wealthy citizens competed to fund choruses, the liturgy, a public service the rich performed. Every citizen could attend, with the poorest receiving admission, money from the state. Attending theatre was participation in democracy, a ritual as important as voting in the assembly or serving on juries. Speaking of juries, Athens's legal system was itself remarkably democratic. Juries consisted of hundreds of citizens, sometimes 500 or more selected by lot. No judges, no lawyers in our modern sense. Citizens prosecuted and defended themselves, though professional speechwriters could compose arguments. The jury voted directly, with no deliberation, no discussion. Majority ruled. This meant that persuasion mattered enormously. Cases were won not just on facts, but on rhetoric, the art of speaking persuasively. This need for persuasive speech created opportunities for teachers called sophists, wise men who taught rhetoric, philosophy, and practical skills for success in democratic politics. The sophists were controversial. Some, like Protagoras, made genuine contributions to philosophy and education. Others, seemed to teach tricks for making weak arguments appear strong, how to win cases regardless of justice. Socrates, Athens's most famous philosopher, opposed the sophists precisely because they seemed to prioritize victory over truth. Socrates, strange, ugly, brilliant Socrates, stands at the center of Athens's intellectual life. Born around 469 BC, he never wrote anything himself. We know him through Plato's dialogues, where he appears as a character questioning everyone he meets. The Socratic method, as it came to be called, involved asking questions that revealed contradictions in people's beliefs. Someone claims to know what courage is. Socrates asks questions. The person's definition collapses into incoherence. Socrates claims to know nothing himself, only that others who think they know are mistaken. This made him deeply annoying. Picture Socrates in the Agora, Athens's central marketplace and public square. He approaches prominent citizens, politicians, sophists. Tell me, what is justice? They provide definitions. Socrates asks more questions. The definitions unravel. The experts discover they cannot define concepts they claim to understand. Some responded with humility, grateful for the exposure of their ignorance. Others resented Socrates, seeing him as a pest undermining certainty and confidence. But Socrates insisted he performed a sacred duty. He believed the unexamined life was not worth living, that people should question their assumptions, that true wisdom began with recognizing one's ignorance. He compared himself to a gadfly stinging a lazy horse Athens, keeping it alert and active through constant questioning. The Agora where Socrates taught was the beating heart of Athenian democracy, not a formal school but an open space where citizens gathered for commerce, politics, and conversation. Imagine the scene: merchants selling goods from across the Mediterranean, money changers conducting business, citizens reading laws inscribed on stone stelae, politicians delivering speeches, philosophers debating. The Council of 500, chosen by lot to prepare business for the assembly meeting in the Bouleuterion. Courts in session, juries deliberating, foreigners arriving to trade or settle, slaves accompanying masters. The whole complex, noisy, vibrant chaos of democratic life concentrated in one place. Nearby was the Pnyx, the hill where the assembly met. Picture 5,000 or 6,000 citizens gathering on the stone seats carved into the hillside. This was direct democracy at work. Any citizen could speak, could propose laws, could address his fellows as equals. The herald would ask, "Who wishes to speak?" Anyone could step forward. Not everyone spoke. Some citizens were naturally more influential, better speakers, more politically engaged. But the right to speak belonged to all, and major decisions required assembly approval. The assembly decided war and peace, passed laws, elected generals, reviewed magistrates' conduct. It ostracized, literally citizens deemed dangerous to the democracy, by voting their names on pottery shards. Ostraka. If 6,000 votes were cast, and a majority named one person, he was exiled for 10 years. This was not punishment for crime, but preventative measure removing anyone who seemed to threaten democratic equality before they could establish tyranny. This system, radical in its equality, had significant limitations. Only adult male citizens participated. Women, however important to Athens's social and religious life, held no political rights. Metics, foreigners residing in Athens, could not vote or hold office, though they paid taxes and served in the military. And slaves, who formed perhaps a third of the population, had no rights at all. Slavery troubles modern sensibilities. How could Athenians, who valued freedom so highly, own slaves? The Greeks themselves never satisfactorily answered this question. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century, argued that some people were natural slaves an argument that even then was controversial. Most Greeks simply accepted slavery as a fact of life, as normal and natural as the weather. Slaves came from many sources: war captives, children of slaves, people sold into slavery for debt in non-Greek societies. They performed labor that freed citizens for politics, warfare, and leisure. Yet women's roles, while limited politically, were crucial in other spheres. They managed households oikoi, which in Athens meant significant responsibility. They controlled domestic slaves, managed finances, supervised food production, raised children, and participated in religious festivals. The Thesmophoria, a festival honoring Demeter, was exclusively female. At this 3-day celebration, women left their homes, camped together, performed sacred rites, and conducted secret rituals men were forbidden to witness. Religion provided spaces where women exercised authority and community bonds independent of male oversight. Athens's intellectual life extended beyond Socrates and the sophists. The doctor, Hippocrates, though from the island of Kos, worked in Athens and revolutionized medicine by separating it from religious ritual. The Hippocratic corpus writings attributed to him and his followers approached disease as natural phenomenon, not divine punishment. Symptoms should be observed, patterns noted, treatments tested. The Hippocratic Oath, still invoked by physicians, commits doctors to ethical practice and patient welfare. Philosophers called natural philosophers physikoi investigated the natural world. Anaxagoras proposed that the sun was a hot stone, the moon reflected the sun's light, and nous mind organized matter into cosmos. These ideas threatened traditional religion. Anaxagoras was prosecuted for impiety, denying the gods, though he escaped severe punishment through Pericles' intervention. Architecture, sculpture, drama, philosophy, medicine, in all these fields, Athens excelled. But the driving force behind much of this achievement was Pericles, who dominated Athenian politics for 3 decades. Born around 495 BC to an aristocratic family, Pericles became the leading democratic politician through oratory, vision, and political skill. He championed the poor, extended democracy, paid citizens for jury service and assembly attendance so even the poorest could participate, and oversaw the Acropolis building program. Pericles articulated Athens's democratic vision most clearly in his famous funeral oration, delivered in 431 BC to honor war dead. Thucydides, the historian, records it, or his version of it. Whether Pericles spoke exactly these words matters less than that they captured Athens's self-understanding at its peak. Our constitution, Pericles said, does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Our government is called democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people. When it is a question of settling private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. When it is a question of putting one person before another in positions of public responsibility, what counts is not membership of a particular class, but the actual ability which the man possesses. He continued, we do not say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business. We say that he has no business here at all. Citizenship meant participation. To live in Athens but ignore public affairs was to betray the city that protected you. We are lovers of beauty without extravagance, Pericles declared, and lovers of wisdom without softness. Athens valued both aesthetic achievement and intellectual rigor. The city spent lavishly on temples and festivals, but not wastefully. Citizens pursued philosophy and arts, but remained tough enough to fight when necessary. This balance, beauty and strength, thought and action, individual excellence and collective responsibility defined Athens's golden age. The city was simultaneously a military power, an economic hub, a cultural center, and a democracy where ordinary citizens governed themselves. This combination, achieved briefly in the mid-5th century, produced achievements that still astonish. Consider the daily life of an Athenian citizen. Let us imagine Callias, a man of moderate means. He wakes in his modest house in the city. His wife manages the household, supervises the 1 or 2 slaves the family owns, prepares meals. Callias walks to the agora. Perhaps he has business, a lawsuit to pursue, a vote in the assembly if it meets today, goods to buy or sell. He exercises at the gymnasium, wrestling or running with other citizens while discussing politics and philosophy. He might encounter Socrates asking uncomfortable questions. He returns home for dinner. In the evening, he might attend a symposium at a friend's house, reclining on couches, drinking wine mixed with water, conversing about poetry, politics, love, ethics, occasionally hiring musicians or entertainers. If a major dramatic festival is occurring, Callias attends the theatre. He sits on stone benches with thousands of fellow citizens, watching actors in masks perform tragedies or comedies. The plays begin at dawn and continue all day. He watches 3 tragedies and a satyr play a bawdy comedy following the tragedies from each competing playwright, then votes on which playwright deserves the prize. This is life in humanity's most democratic city, where citizens govern themselves, where public participation is not just right but duty, where culture and politics intertwine inseparably. Yet even at its height, Athens' golden age contained seeds of its destruction. The city's cultural achievements rested partly on imperial power. The Delian League, formed to defend Greece against Persia, had gradually become an Athenian empire. Member states paid tribute money supposedly for common defense, but increasingly used for Athenian purposes. The Parthenon was built partly with allies' money, which those allies resented. When states tried to leave the League, Athens forced them back, sometimes brutally. Sparta watched Athens' growing power with alarm. The Peloponnesian War, which began in 431 BC, would test whether Athens could maintain its cultural achievements while fighting a total war against Greek rivals. The war would last 27 years. It would kill Pericles. It would corrupt Athenian democracy. It would demonstrate that civilization, however glorious, remains fragile when war's pressures mount. But in 440 BC, before the war's full horror revealed itself, Athens stood at its peak. The Parthenon gleamed on the Acropolis. Sophocles was writing his greatest plays. Socrates was questioning everyone in the agora. Democracy functioned. Citizens participated. The city that had saved Greece from Persia now led Greece in culture and thought. It was a moment of perfect flowering. Not permanent, nothing is. Not without flaws, no human achievement is flawless, but real, magnificent, a demonstration of what humans can create when freed from tyranny, when given voice in their governance, when encouraged to think, question, and build. Athens, in its golden age, remains our touchstone for human potential. We measure other societies against it. We ask, did they achieve Athens' heights? Could they match Athens' combination of democracy, culture, and power? Usually, the answer is no. Athens' moment was unique, extraordinary, and unrepeatable. But it was also fragile, and the war that would test it, that would ultimately break it, had already begun. There are wars that settle disputes, and there are wars that destroy civilizations. The Peloponnesian War, which began in 431 BC and dragged on for 27 years, was the latter. It was not merely a conflict between Athens and Sparta, not simply a struggle for supremacy in Greece. It was a war that corroded the very culture it was meant to protect, that revealed the fragility of civilization, that demonstrated how quickly the achievements of peace can be consumed by the demands of war. The roots of the conflict ran deep. Athens and Sparta had fought together against Persia, united by common threat. but they were profoundly different societies with incompatible worldviews. Athens was democratic, commercial, naval, imperial, cosmopolitan, constantly changing. Sparta was oligarchic, agricultural, land-based, conservative, isolated, unchanging. Athens championed innovation and freedom. Sparta valued order and tradition. As long as Persia threatened, these differences could be set aside. Once Persia withdrew, they became sources of tension. Athens's transformation of the Delian League into an empire alarmed Sparta. Greek cities that had joined voluntarily to resist Persia now found themselves subjects of Athens, paying tribute, hosting Athenian garrisons, forced to remain in the league even when they wished to leave. When Naxos tried to secede, Athens besieged and conquered it. When Thasos revolted, Athens crushed the rebellion, tore down its walls, and confiscated its fleet. The league meant to defend freedom had become an instrument of control. Sparta, leading the Peloponnesian League of conservative oligarchies, saw Athens as a threat not just to Greek independence, but to their entire way of life. If Athens could transform allies into subjects, force democracies on oligarchic cities, build an empire through sea power, what would stop them from eventually challenging Sparta itself? The immediate cause of war was relatively minor disputes over Corcyra and Potidæa, cities caught between Athenian and Spartan spheres. But the underlying cause was structural. Thucydides, the war's historian, who lived through it and analyzed it with cold brilliance, wrote that the war was inevitable. The growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta made war inevitable. This is a profound insight. Wars sometimes occur not because of particular grievances, but because of systemic pressures, because two powers cannot coexist without eventually colliding. Athens could not stop expanding without betraying its democratic, commercial nature. Sparta could not tolerate Athens's expansion without abandoning its role as protector of oligarchic stability. Something had to give. Pericles, still dominating Athens when war began, had a clear strategy. Sparta's strength was its army, the finest heavy infantry in Greece. Athens could not match Spartan hoplites in pitched battle, but Athens's strength was its navy and its walls. The long walls connected Athens to its port, Piraeus, creating a fortified corridor to the sea. As long as Athens controlled the sea, it could import grain, maintain its empire, and avoid the decisive land battle Sparta wanted. Pericles' plan was defensive. Athens would not challenge Sparta on land. Instead, the population would abandon the countryside and shelter behind the walls. The Spartan army could ravage Athenian territory, burn farms, cut olive trees, but they could not breach the walls or starve Athens while the navy controlled the sea. Eventually, Sparta would exhaust itself. The empire's wealth would sustain Athens until Sparta accepted terms. It was a rational plan. It might have worked, but in the war's second year, 430 BC, catastrophe struck. A plague entered Athens through Piraeus, brought by ship from Ethiopia or Libya. In the crowded conditions behind the walls, thousands of refugees from the countryside packed into the city. It spread with terrifying speed. Thucydides caught the plague and survived to describe it. The symptoms were horrific: high fever, inflammation of the eyes, bleeding from the throat and tongue, foul breath, vomiting, violent spasms, skin covered with pustules and ulcers. Most victims died on the 7th or 9th day. Those who survived often lost fingers, toes, eyesight, or memory. The suffering was indescribable, but the plague's psychological effects were worse than physical. Consider what Thucydides reports. People abandoned dying relatives rather than risk infection. Bodies piled up in the streets. Sacred rites were neglected. People stopped bothering with proper funerals, throwing corpses onto others' funeral pyres or leaving them to rot. Some turned to desperate pleasure-seeking, reasoning that since death was certain, they might as well enjoy their final days. Others abandoned all moral restraint. Law and custom lost meaning when death made all men equal and immediate. The plague, Thucydides writes, introduced into the city a greater lawlessness than before. Men now did quite openly what they had previously done in secret, seeing the rapid changes of fortune experienced by the rich, who suddenly died, and by those who had previously been poor but now inherited their wealth. They resolved to spend their money quickly on pleasure, since both wealth and life seemed equally ephemeral. Think about what this means. Athens prided itself on law, on civic virtue, on the bonds of citizenship that held the community together. The plague shattered these bonds. When people no longer trust that the gods will protect them, no longer believe in divine justice, no longer fear punishment, either divine or human, civilization begins to dissolve. The plague attacked not just bodies but the social fabric itself. Pericles himself died in the plague, not in its first wave, but after catching it later. His death deprived Athens of its most capable leader at the worst possible moment. The politicians who followed him were less statesmanlike, more given to demagoguery, more willing to appeal to the assembly's worst impulses for personal advantage. After Pericles' death, Athenian strategy became less coherent. The conservative general Nicias urged caution. The aggressive demagogue Cleon demanded offensive action. The brilliant but unreliable Alcibiades swung between extremes. Without Pericles' steadying influence, Athens lurched between defensive caution and reckless aggression. The war settled into a stalemate. Each spring, Spartan armies invaded Attica, ravaging the countryside. Each summer, Athenian fleets raided the Peloponnese. Neither side could force decisive victory. Sparta could not breach Athens's walls. Athens could not defeat Sparta's army. The war ground on, year after year, consuming resources, disrupting trade, killing soldiers, and gradually corroding the civilized values both sides claimed to defend. In 427 BC, the city of Mytilene on Lesbos revolted from the Athenian Empire. Athens suppressed the revolt, and the assembly debated Mytilene's punishment. Cleon proposed killing all adult males and enslaving women and children, the standard Greek practice for rebellious subjects. The assembly, in a moment of anger and fear, voted to approve. A trireme was dispatched to carry out the massacre. The next day, some Athenians reconsidered. Was such brutality necessary? Was it just? The assembly met again for the famous Mytilenean debate, preserved by Thucydides. Cleon argued that mercy was weakness. Mytilene had betrayed Athens in wartime. Their punishment must terrify other cities into loyalty. Do not be led astray by pity or by ordinary decency, he urged. The empire required harsh measures. Democracy within Athens was fine, but toward subjects, Athens must rule through fear. Diodotus, opposing Cleon, made a different argument. Not that mercy was just, he conceded that Mytilene deserved punishment, but that massacre was impractical. It would make all future revolts desperate struggles to the death, since cities would know surrender meant extermination. Better to punish only the leaders, sparing the common people, creating incentives for cities to surrender rather than fight to the last. The assembly voted again. By the narrowest margin, they reversed the previous decision. A second trireme was dispatched, racing the first. It arrived barely in time. The massacre was averted. Only about 1,000 ringleaders were executed instead of the entire male population. This debate reveals something troubling about wartime Athens. The question was not whether to be merciful, but which policy better served Athenian interests. Justice, compassion, the values Athens claimed to embody, these were subordinated to imperial calculation. Democracy had not made Athens gentle. It had made imperial cruelty a matter for popular vote. Worse was to come. In 416 BC, Athens sent envoys to the neutral island of Melos, demanding it join the Athenian Empire. The Melians, who were ethnically Spartan but had remained neutral throughout the war, refused. The resulting discussion, the Melian dialogue, is preserved by Thucydides as one of the most chilling exchanges in ancient literature. The Athenians dispensed with normal diplomatic courtesy. They spoke bluntly. "You know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." The Melians appealed to justice, to the gods, to international opinion. The Athenians dismissed it all. Justice was irrelevant. The gods favoured the strong. Other Greeks would not intervene. Melos must choose, join Athens or be destroyed. The Melians refused. Athens besieged the island. When it fell, the Athenians killed all adult males and enslaved women and children. An entire community was erased because it insisted on neutrality. This was Athens, the city of Pericles, of Sophocles, of Socrates speaking. The city that claimed to be the school of Greece, the defender of freedom, the exemplar of civilization. The war had transformed Athens from liberator to tyrant, from defender of Greek independence to oppressor of Greek cities. Thucydides records the Melian dialogue without explicit judgment. He simply shows what Athens had become, but his meaning is clear. War corrupts, power corrupts. The same democracy that produced the Parthenon and Socratic dialogue also voted for the Mytilenean massacre and the Melian genocide. The capacity for greatness and the capacity for atrocity coexist in human nature, in human societies. Civilization is always one war away from barbarism. The war's greatest catastrophe came in 415 BC. Alcibiades, brilliant and ambitious, proposed an expedition to conquer Sicily. Syracuse, Sicily's greatest city, was allied with Sparta. If Athens could conquer Syracuse, it would control Sicily's grain exports, eliminate Sparta's ally, and potentially dominate the Western Mediterranean. The scheme was wildly ambitious. Sicily was far from Athens, perhaps a week's sail in good conditions. An expedition would require enormous resources and would leave Athens's immediate sphere vulnerable. But Alcibiades was persuasive, and the assembly was in an expansionist mood. Nicias, the conservative general, opposed the plan. When the assembly insisted, Nicias tried to discourage them by demanding an enormous force, 134 triremes, thousands of hoplites, massive supplies. He hoped the scale would make them reconsider. Instead, the assembly enthusiastically voted to provide everything Nicias requested and more. The expedition would be Athens's greatest military adventure, a chance for glory and wealth, an opportunity to demonstrate Athens's power to the world. Just before the fleet sailed, a scandal erupted. Throughout Athens, the Hermes, sacred statues of Hermes that stood at crossroads and doorways, essentially stone pillars with the god's head and an erect phallus, were mutilated in a single night. Someone had systematically defaced these sacred markers. The act was both sacrilege and potential political conspiracy. Who would do such a thing? Why? Alcibiades' enemies accused him of involvement. The accusations became entangled with charges that he and his friends had performed mock mysteries parodying the sacred Eleusinian rites at drunken parties. Alcibiades demanded an immediate trial to clear his name before the fleet sailed. His enemies insisted he sail first, promising a fair trial on his return. Alcibiades sailed under a cloud of suspicion. Once in Sicily, Athens recalled him for trial. Rather than return to face uncertain justice, Alcibiades defected to Sparta, providing the Spartans with military advice against Athens. His defection turned the expedition's most capable general into an enemy. The Sicilian expedition was doomed from the start. Syracuse proved far harder to conquer than anticipated. The city had strong walls, a capable general in Hermocrates, and eventually received Spartan reinforcements. The siege dragged on for months, then years. Athenian resources were consumed. Reinforcements arrived, but could not break the stalemate. Disease, exhaustion, and demoralization set in. In 413 BC, the Athenians finally attempted withdrawal. Syracusan forces blocked their fleet in the harbour. The Athenians fought desperately to escape, but were defeated in a series of naval battles. Their ships were destroyed or captured. The survivors abandoned their ships and tried to escape overland, trudging through Sicily's interior, harassed constantly by Syracusan cavalry and light troops. Thucydides' description of the retreat is heartbreaking. Thousands of men, wounded and exhausted, struggled through hostile territory without adequate food or water. The sick and wounded were abandoned, their comrades unable to carry them, their cries haunting those who left them behind. At the river Acinarus, the desperate Athenians broke ranks to drink, and Syracusans massacred them as they crowded the water. The surviving generals were executed. The remaining soldiers, perhaps 7,000 men, were imprisoned in Syracusan stone quarries, exposed to the elements, given minimal food and water. Most died in captivity. A few were ransomed or sold as slaves. Some, according to legend, gained freedom by reciting passages from Euripides' plays to Syracusans, who admired his poetry, a reminder that even in catastrophe, Greek culture remained common ground. The Sicilian disaster was total. Athens lost 200 ships, thousands of citizens, enormous treasure. The flower of Athenian youth, the men who had voted for the expedition in the assembly with such enthusiasm, died far from home in a war of choice that should never have been fought. Consider what this meant for Athens. The city had sacrificed a generation for imperial ambition. The expedition served no defensive purpose. Sicily did not threaten Athens. Syracuse was not preparing to attack. Athens chose this war out of greed and overconfidence, and paid a price that nearly destroyed the city. The disaster emboldened Sparta and Athens' enemies. Sparta established a permanent fort at Decelia in Attica, denying Athens access to its countryside year-round. Persian money flowed to Sparta, building ships to challenge Athenian naval supremacy. Athens' subject cities, sensing weakness, revolted. The empire Athens had built over decades began crumbling. Within Athens, the political situation deteriorated. In 411 BC, oligarchs staged a coup, establishing the government of the 400. Democracy was suspended. The coup failed after a few months, replaced by a moderate oligarchy of 5,000, then restored democracy. But the fact that oligarchs could seize power, even briefly, showed how war-strained democratic institutions. Socrates, watching Athens' moral decline, continued questioning. He insisted that virtue and knowledge were linked, that understanding justice made one just. But war demonstrated daily that knowledge of justice did not prevent injustice. Smart, educated citizens voted for the Mytilenean massacre, for the Melian genocide, for the Sicilian expedition. Democracy enabled terrible decisions as easily as wise ones. The war's final years saw Athens fight on through sheer determination. The city rebuilt its fleet, won surprising victories, even seemed on the verge of recovery, but exhaustion and resource depletion eventually told. At Aegospotami, in 405 BC, the Spartan general Lysander surprised and destroyed the Athenian fleet. With no ships, no money, and no hope of resupply, Athens was besieged by land and sea. In 404 BC, Athens surrendered. The terms were harsh but not brutal. The long walls were torn down to flute music celebration of Athens's humiliation. The fleet was reduced to 12 ships. Athens's empire was dissolved, but the city itself was spared destruction, partly because Sparta's allies, Corinth and Thebes, wanted Athens razed completely. Sparta, remembering Athens's role in the Persian Wars, refused to destroy it entirely. The Peloponnesian War ended with no real victor. Sparta won militarily, but lacked the capacity to govern the empire it had liberated. Within decades, Sparta would be as despised as Athens had been. The war weakened all of Greece, killing tens of thousands, disrupting trade, destabilizing governments, and destroying the trust that held Greek civilization together. Thucydides, writing his history of the war, sought to understand what happened and why. He concluded that the war revealed permanent features of human nature, ambition, fear, honor, that drove societies to conflict despite knowing war's costs. His history was not just about the Peloponnesian War, but about all wars, a guide to understanding why humans repeatedly destroy what they have built. The cultural cost was incalculable. Sophocles died just before the war's end, having witnessed Athens's decline. Euripides fled to Macedonia, dying in exile. Socrates, who had questioned everything, would be tried and executed by democratic Athens in 399 BC, accused of corrupting youth and impiety charges stemming partly from his association with Alcibiades and other students who had become oligarchs or traitors. The city that celebrated philosophy executed its greatest philosopher. The Parthenon still stood, but Athens's golden age was finished. The confidence, the cultural creativity, the sense that Athens was creating something unprecedented, all this died in the war. What survived was memory and achievement. The plays, the philosophy, the architecture remained, but the living culture that produced them was gone, consumed by a war that neither side truly won. Greek civilization would continue. Philosophy would reach new heights in the 4th century. Alexander would spread Greek culture across the known world. But the particular moment when everything came together, democratic politics, cultural achievement, military power, philosophical inquiry, that moment ended with the Peloponnesian War. It ended because war consumes the values it claims to defend, because democracies can be as cruel as tyrannies when frightened, because civilizations, however magnificent, remain fragile constructions easily destroyed by human passions and mistakes. The war taught Greeks, and through them, all subsequent civilizations, that greatness and catastrophe are never far apart, that the same energies that build can destroy, that humanity's highest achievements remain vulnerable to humanity's darkest impulses. The lesson, written in 27 years of suffering, is one we are still learning. There is something remarkable about resilience. Not the resilience of never breaking, that is mere rigidity, but the resilience of breaking and then growing in new directions, adapting to changed circumstances, finding meaning in a world transformed by loss. This was Greece in the 4th century BC. The confident, imperial Athens of Pericles was gone, destroyed by plague and war. But Greek culture did not end. It evolved, deepened, and in some ways achieved insights more profound than the Golden Age's triumphant certainties. The death of Socrates in 399 BC marked both an ending and a beginning. The old philosopher, then 70 years old, was brought to trial on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. The accusations were vague, probably motivated by his association with Alcibiades and Critias, 2 of his former students who had betrayed Athens. But they also reflected genuine unease with Socrates' relentless questioning, his challenge to traditional assumptions, his insistence that examined life was superior to unexamined convention. Socrates defended himself before a jury of 500 citizens. He did not beg for mercy. He did not flatter the jury. Instead, He insisted he had performed a sacred service to Athens, acting as a gadfly stinging the city into awareness. Far from deserving death, he deserved to be maintained at public expense in the Prytaneum, an honor reserved for Olympic victors and great benefactors of the state. This defense, more provocation than plea, alienated many jurors. They voted to convict by a margin of about 60 votes, close, but sufficient. When asked to propose a counterpenalty to death, Athenian law allowed the convicted to suggest an alternative punishment. Socrates first suggested the maintenance in the Prytaneum, then mockingly proposed a tiny fine. Finally, persuaded by friends, he offered a more substantial sum, but the jury, now more offended than before, voted for death by larger margin. Socrates spent his final month in prison, visited by friends and students. Plato's dialogue Phaedo describes the last day. Socrates discussed philosophy with his companions, exploring whether the soul is immortal, whether death should be feared. He argued that philosophers spend their lives preparing for death by separating soul from bodily concerns. Death is not evil but release. When the time came, Socrates drank the hemlock calmly. The poison worked slowly, gradually numbing his body from feet upward. When the numbness reached his heart, he would die. His last words, according to Plato, were, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt, and do not neglect it." A sacrifice to the god of healing, perhaps, because death heals the disease of life, or simply a reminder to fulfill ritual obligations even at the end. Socrates' death shocked his followers. How could democratic Athens, the enlightened city, execute its wisest citizen for asking questions? The execution suggested that democracy, at least in its Athenian form, was flawed. It could not distinguish wisdom from sophistry, could not protect philosophy from popular anger, could not rise above the passions and fears that had corrupted Athens during the war. Among those who witnessed Socrates' imprisonment, though not the final day, he was ill was Plato, a young aristocrat who had been Socrates' student. Plato was profoundly affected. He left Athens, traveling to Italy and Sicily, encountering Pythagorean philosophers and engaging with different intellectual traditions. When he returned, perhaps 20 years after Socrates' death, he founded a school outside Athens called the Academy. The Academy was revolutionary. Previous philosophers had taught individually or in informal groups. Plato created an institution, a community of scholars studying mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and dialectic. Above the entrance, tradition says, was inscribed, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." Mathematics was foundational to understanding reality, Plato believed, because mathematical truths were eternal and perfect, unlike the changing, imperfect physical world. Plato's philosophy emerged from Socratic questioning but went far beyond. Where Socrates focused on ethical questions, what is justice, courage, piety, Plato constructed a comprehensive metaphysics. He proposed that the physical world we perceive is merely shadow and reflection of a higher reality, the realm of forms or ideas, the form of the good, the form of beauty, the form of justice. These eternal, perfect archetypes exist beyond physical reality, and particular instances of good, beauty, or justice in our world are imperfect copies. Consider what this means. When we call something beautiful, we recognize in it a participation in the form of beauty itself. When we identify an action as just, we perceive its relationship to the form of justice. True knowledge, then, is not knowledge of particular things, but knowledge of forms, eternal truths that reason can grasp but senses cannot perceive. This theory had profound implications. If forms are eternal and unchanging, while the physical world is temporary and changing, then ultimate reality is not material but ideal. The soul, being capable of grasping forms, must be more real than the body. Philosophy's purpose is training the soul to ascend from shadows, physical things, toward light, eternal forms. Plato's most famous work, The Republic, explores these ideas through the metaphor of a city. Socrates, the dialogue's main character, describes an ideal polis organized according to justice. The city has three classes: guardians who rule, auxiliaries who defend, and producers who make goods. Similarly, the soul has three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Justice exists when each part performs its proper function. Reason ruling, spirit supporting reason, appetite controlled. The Republic's most famous passage is the allegory of the cave. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave, facing a wall, unable to turn around. Behind them burns a fire, and between fire and prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners, seeing only shadows, believe shadows are reality. If a prisoner were freed and forced to turn around, he would see the fire and objects' reality's next level. If dragged outside the cave, he would eventually see the sun itself, the form of the good, source of all truth and reality. Most people, Plato suggests, are like the prisoners, mistaking shadows for reality. Philosophers are those who escape the cave and see truth. But if a philosopher returns to the cave to free others, the prisoners, comfortable with their illusions, might kill him, as Athens killed Socrates. The Republic also proposes that philosophers should rule. Only those who grasp eternal forms understand justice and goodness. Only they should govern. Democracy, which gives power to the ignorant many rather than the wise few, inevitably produces bad government. Better an enlightened monarchy or aristocracy rule by the best than rule by the mob. This was a direct challenge to Athenian democracy. Plato had witnessed democracy condemn Socrates, vote for disastrous wars, oscillate between demagoguery and oligarchy. He concluded that democracy was fundamentally flawed. Most people lack the wisdom to govern themselves. They are ruled by appetites, swayed by rhetoric, incapable of grasping abstract justice. True wisdom requires philosophical training, decades of mathematical study, dialectical reasoning, and contemplation of forms. Only philosopher kings, raised from childhood in rigorous intellectual discipline, could govern justly. Plato's vision was profoundly anti-democratic, yet it emerged directly from democratic Athens' failures. If democracy could not prevent war, could not protect wisdom, could not govern justly, perhaps democracy was the problem. Perhaps the solution was rule by wisdom rather than rule by the people. For nearly 40 years, Plato taught at the Academy. Students came from across Greece and beyond, studying mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Among them was a young man from Stagira in northern Greece, Aristotle. Aristotle joined the Academy at age 17 and remained for 20 years until Plato's death in 347 BC. He then left Athens, eventually becoming tutor to Alexander, son of Philip of Macedon. After Alexander became king and began his conquests, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum, in 335 BC. Where Plato sought ultimate reality beyond the physical world, Aristotle grounded philosophy in observation. He studied biology, dissecting animals, classifying species, noting their behaviors. He investigated politics, collecting and analyzing constitutions from 158 different city-states. He explored physics, ethics, logic, metaphysics, poetics, systematically examining every field of knowledge with the same empirical attention. Aristotle disagreed with Plato's forms. Ultimate reality, Aristotle argued, exists in particular things, not in some separate realm. The universal hoarseness, does not exist apart from actual horses. It exists in horses as the form that makes matter into horse rather than something else. Every object combines matter, the stuff it is, made of, and form, the organizing principle that makes it what it is. This has subtle but important implications. For Plato, true reality is eternal and unchanging. For Aristotle, true reality is the concrete world we inhabit, with all its change and development. Philosophy's task is understanding this world, not escaping to another. Aristotle's ethics similarly grounded abstract principles in practical life. His Nicomachean Ethics explores how humans achieve eudaimonia, flourishing, or happiness through virtue. Virtue is not abstract knowledge of the form of the good, but practical wisdom, phronesis, developed through habit and practice. We become just by doing just acts, courageous by performing courageous acts. Virtue is a disposition, cultivated over time, to choose the mean between extremes. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and profligacy. The good life, according to Aristotle, involves both practical virtue and contemplation. Humans are rational animals. Our distinctive excellence lies in using reason well. The highest happiness comes from contemplation theoria, which is most godlike activity and therefore most fulfilling for humans. But this contemplative life requires leisure, material security, friends, and political participation. We cannot flourish in isolation. We need the polis. Yet even as Aristotle wrote about the polis's importance, the polis system was ending. By the mid-4th century, the independent city-state was becoming obsolete. New powers, first Thebes, then Macedon, were dominating Greece. The world for which Plato and Aristotle theorized was disappearing, replaced by larger kingdoms and eventually empires. While philosophers pursued wisdom, daily life in 4th century Greece evolved. The gymnasium remained central to Greek culture, not just a place for physical exercise, but for education, socializing, and philosophical discussion. Young men exercised. Naked gymnos means naked wrestling, running, throwing discus and javelin. They discussed philosophy with teachers. They formed bonds that lasted lifetimes. The gymnasium embodied the Greek ideal of kalos kagathos, beautiful and good, combining physical excellence with moral and intellectual cultivation. Greek art evolved from the classical ideal. 5th century sculpture sought perfect, idealized beauty, the Doryphoros, Polykleitos' canon of perfect proportions, or Phidias's serene gods. 4th century sculpture became more individualized, more emotional. Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Cnidos was the first monumental female, nude, sensuous, human, rather than distant and divine. Scopas created anguished faces and twisted bodies expressing suffering and passion. Lysippus portrayed Alexander with a melting gaze and wild hair, capturing personality rather than ideal type. Theatre continued evolving. The great tragedians were gone, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, all dead by the 4th century's beginning. But comedy adapted. Old comedy Aristophanes' topical political satire gave way to new comedy, focusing on domestic situations, mistaken identities, young lovers thwarted by complications. Menander, the greatest new comedy playwright, wrote plays about everyday people in ordinary situations, far from the mythological grandeur of tragedy, but perhaps more directly relevant to audiences' lives. Mystery religions grew increasingly popular. The Eleusinian Mysteries, celebrating Demeter and Persephone's myth, promised initiates blessed afterlife. Exactly what occurred during the secret rites remains unknown. Participants were forbidden to reveal them on pain of death. But thousands of Greeks underwent initiation, seeking personal salvation and assurance of immortality that traditional Olympian religion did not clearly provide. The cult of Dionysus, always ecstatic and emotionally intense, spread further. Dionysian worship involved losing oneself in wine, music, and dance, temporary transcendence of normal consciousness. Later, sources describe maenads, female worshippers, roaming mountains in inspired frenzy, tearing animals apart with their hands. Whether such practices occurred literally or were mythological representations of spiritual experience, Dionysian religion offered release from rational control that appealed to many Greeks. Other Eastern religious influences entered Greece. The cult of the healing god Asclepius spread, with suppliants sleeping in his temples hoping for divine healing dreams. The worship of Egyptian Isis and Serapis gained followers. These religions emphasized personal relationship with divinity, individual salvation, and emotional connection, quite different from traditional Greek religions' focus on community, ritual, and proper observance. Philosophy, too, moved toward practical guidance for living. Two new schools emerged that would profoundly influence Hellenistic and Roman thought: Epicureanism and Stoicism. Epicurus, who founded his school the Garden in Athens around 307 BC, taught that pleasure is life's goal. But by pleasure, he did not mean indulgence. True pleasure, Epicurus argued, is absence of pain, ataraxia, tranquility, and freedom from disturbance. The wise person avoids politics, limits desires to natural and necessary ones, cultivates friendship, and studies philosophy to eliminate fear, especially fear of gods and death. The gods exist, Epicurus taught, but they are perfectly happy and do not interfere in human affairs. They neither punish nor reward. Fear of divine punishment is irrational and disturbs tranquility. Death is merely the dissolution of atoms that compose us. When we exist, death is not present. When death is present, we do not exist. Therefore, death is nothing to us. By eliminating fear of gods and death, philosophy liberates us to live pleasantly in the present. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BC, taught almost the opposite. The Stoics took their name from the Stoa Poikile painted porch in Athens' Agora, where Zeno taught. They believed in living according to nature, accepting fate, performing duty, cultivating virtue regardless of external circumstances. The cosmos, Stoics argued, is rationally ordered by divine logos, reason or word. Everything happens according to fate. Fighting fate is futile. Wisdom means accepting what cannot be changed while doing one's duty without attachment to outcomes. External things, wealth, health, reputation, are indifferent. Only virtue matters. A wise person, the Stoic sage, remains unmoved by fortune's changes, neither elated by success nor despairing at failure. This might sound fatalistic, but Stoicism was actually empowering. If only virtue matters, and virtue depends entirely on your choices, then your happiness is entirely in your control. No one can make you act badly. No external circumstance can destroy your essential self. You are free, even in chains, as long as your will remains aligned with reason and virtue. Both Epicureanism and Stoicism represented philosophy adapting to a changing world. The polis, the small, face-to-face community where citizens governed themselves, was ending. Individual Greeks increasingly felt powerless before larger forces, kings, armies, economic changes. Philosophy responded by focusing on what individuals could control: their inner lives, their choices, their attitudes. If you cannot control external events, at least you can control your response to them. This shift from political to personal philosophy reflected broader changes. The 4th century saw constant warfare as Greek city-states struggled for supremacy. Thebes briefly dominated after defeating Sparta at Leuctra in 371 BC. Athens recovered enough to lead the Second Athenian League. Sparta declined, but no city-state could establish lasting hegemony. Greece exhausted itself in constant conflict. Into this power, vacuum came Macedon. Philip II, who became king in 359 BC, transformed Macedon from a backward kingdom into Greece's dominant power. He created a professional army, developed new tactics, the Macedonian phalanx with its long sarissas, pikes 18 feet long, and diplomatically and militarily subdued Greece city by city. Most Greeks despised Philip as a barbarian. Demosthenes, Athens' greatest orator, delivered passionate speeches, the Philippics urging resistance. But Athens and its allies were defeated at Chaeronea in 338 BC. Philip was generous in victory, not destroying Athens but establishing the League of Corinth, binding Greek cities in alliance under Macedonian leadership. Greek independence, in the traditional sense, was finished. Yet Greek culture was not. Philip admired Greek civilization. He hired Aristotle to tutor his son Alexander. He spread Greek language and culture in Macedon. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BC and Alexander became king, the new young king carried Greek civilization with him on campaigns that would spread it across the known world. The 4th century ended with Greece militarily defeated but culturally triumphant. The polis system was finished, the age of independent city-states over. But the culture those city-states created, philosophy, art, theatre, literature, survived and adapted. Plato and Aristotle's philosophical works would shape thought for 2,000 years. Greek artistic ideals would be copied by Romans and revived in the Renaissance. Greek language would become the international language of learning and trade. Greece had lost its political freedom, but discovered something perhaps more valuable: that culture transcends politics, that ideas outlive empires, that the examined life Socrates championed could continue regardless of who ruled, that human excellence could flourish even in defeat. The Greeks were learning, painfully, that their greatest achievements were not military or political, but intellectual and artistic. They were learning to value wisdom over power, thought over action, culture over conquest. These were hard lessons, bought at the price of independence. But they were lessons that would define the Hellenistic age to come, an age where Greek culture, liberated from the polis, would spread across 3 continents and shape civilizations far beyond Greece itself. There is a paradox in history that takes one's breath away. Greece, conquered militarily by Macedon, would in turn conquer its conquerors culturally. Alexander the Great, who destroyed the last vestiges of polis independence, would spread Greek civilization across 3 continents, creating a world where Greek language, Greek thought, and Greek culture became humanity's common inheritance. The Greeks lost their political freedom but gained cultural immortality. Alexander was 20 when his father Philip was assassinated in 336 BC. He inherited a kingdom in turmoil, with rivals contesting his succession and Greek cities hoping to break free from Macedonian control. Within 2 years, Alexander had secured Macedon, crushed Greek rebellions, destroying Thebes as a warning to others, and prepared for his father's ultimate ambition, invading the Persian Empire. Consider the audacity of this undertaking. Persia still ruled from India to Egypt, commanded millions of subjects, possessed wealth beyond imagination. Alexander commanded perhaps 40,000 soldiers. By any rational calculation, the expedition was madness. But Alexander was not rational in ordinary ways. He believed himself descended from Achilles through his mother and from Heracles through his father. He had been tutored by Aristotle, who instilled in him love of Greek culture and Homer's epics. He carried the Iliad with him on campaign, sleeping with it under his pillow alongside his dagger. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with his army. At the Granicus River, he won his first battle against Persian forces. At Issus, he defeated King Darius III himself, though Darius fled the battlefield, abandoning his family. Alexander treated the Persian royal women with respect, a gesture that impressed many Persians and demonstrated that Alexander could be generous in victory. Rather than pursuing Darius immediately, Alexander secured the eastern Mediterranean coast, besieging Tyre, a seemingly impregnable island city, for 7 months before finally capturing it. He entered Egypt, where he was welcomed as liberator from Persian rule. The Egyptians crowned him pharaoh. He visited the oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis in the Libyan desert, where the priests apparently recognized him as son of Zeus Ammon. Whether Alexander believed this literally or understood it as political theatre matters less than that it reinforced his sense of destiny. In Egypt, Alexander founded Alexandria, the first and greatest of the many cities he would establish bearing his name. The city was designed by the architect Dinocrates on a grid pattern, with wide streets, a magnificent harbour, and plans for temples and public buildings. It would become the jewel of the Hellenistic world, surpassing Athens itself in culture and learning. Then Alexander turned east, pursuing Darius into the heart of Persia. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, he won his decisive victory. Darius again fled, was later murdered by his own nobles, and Alexander claimed the Persian throne. He was now king of Macedon, hegemon of Greece, pharaoh of Egypt, and king of kings of Persia, ruler of the largest empire the world had yet seen. But Alexander was not finished. He pushed east into Central Asia, conquering Bactria and Sogdiana, modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. He married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, honoring local customs while integrating conquered peoples into his empire. He adopted Persian court ceremonial, wore Persian dress on occasion, and promoted fusion of Greek and Persian cultures, a policy his Macedonian veterans resented, but which revealed Alexander's vision of universal empire transcending ethnic boundaries. He crossed into India, defeating King Porus at the Hydaspes River in 326 BC. Despite Porus's war elephants, creatures Macedonians had never faced, Alexander wanted to continue east, to reach the edge of the world as Greeks understood it. But his army, exhausted after 8 years of constant campaigning, refused to march further. For the only time in his career, Alexander had to turn back. The return journey was brutal. Alexander led part of his army through the Gedrosian desert, modern Balochistan, where thousands died of thirst and heat. It was perhaps the campaign's worst disaster, worse than any battle. When he reached Babylon, he was 32 years old and ruled an empire stretching from Greece to India, from Egypt to Central Asia. He planned new campaigns, Arabia, perhaps Carthage and Rome eventually. He was organizing his empire, founding cities, planning irrigation projects, promoting intermarriage between Greeks and Persians. But in June of 323 BC, after days of feasting, Alexander fell ill. The fever grew worse. After 10 days, Alexander died, perhaps from typhoid or malaria, though some suspected poison. His last words, when asked to whom he left his empire, were reportedly to the strongest, or possibly to Kratistos, the name of one of his generals. Either way, he left no clear successor. His half-brother was mentally unfit. His wife Roxana was pregnant but had not yet delivered. The empire plunged into chaos as Alexander's generals, the Diadochi, the successors, fought for control. The wars of succession lasted 40 years. By 280 BC, the empire had fragmented into 3 main kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, and Antigonid Macedon, with smaller kingdoms like Pergamum in Asia Minor and the Greco-Bactrian kingdom in Central Asia, maintaining precarious independence. Alexander's political empire was dead, but his cultural empire was just beginning. Everywhere Alexander's armies went, Greek colonists followed. Soldiers were settled in new cities, Alexandrias, Seleucias, Antiochs, across Asia and Egypt. These cities were built on Greek models with agorae, gymnasiums, theatres, and temples. Greek was the language of administration, trade, and culture. A Greek speaker could travel from Sicily to India and find communities where Greek was spoken, where Homer was read, where the gods were worshipped in familiar ways. Alexandria in Egypt became the greatest centre of Greek culture. Under the Ptolemies, the dynasty descended from Alexander's general Ptolemy, Alexandria grew into a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, rivaling Rome itself. The city's great lighthouse, the Pharos, stood over 400 feet tall, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships safely to harbour. But Alexandria's true glory was intellectual. The Ptolemies founded the museum, literally Temple of the Muses, a research institution where scholars were supported to study, write, and teach. Associated with the museum was the library, which aimed to collect every book in the world. At its height, the library held perhaps 500,000 scrolls, the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world concentrated in one place. Consider what this meant. A scholar in Alexandria had access to works from across the Mediterranean and Near East, Greek philosophy, Egyptian astronomy, Babylonian mathematics, Jewish scriptures, all available in one location. The library employed scholars to acquire, copy, translate, and catalogue texts. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbour had their books confiscated, copied, and returned the copies, often kept by the library, while originals went back to owners. The Ptolemies were obsessed with collecting knowledge. At the museum, Euclid systematized geometry around 300 BC. His Elements became the foundation of mathematical education for 2,000 years. Its logical structure, axioms, propositions, proofs, a model of rigorous reasoning. Archimedes of Syracuse, the greatest mathematician and engineer of antiquity, studied in Alexandria before returning to Sicily. He discovered principles of leverage, calculated pi, invented the Archimedes screw for raising water, and designed war machines that helped Syracuse resist Roman siege. Legend says his last words, as a Roman soldier killed him during Syracuse's fall, were, "Do not disturb my circles." He was working on a geometric problem even as the city fell. Eratosthenes, head of the library in the mid-3rd century BC, calculated Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice in Syene, modern Aswan, the sun shone directly down a well, meaning it was directly overhead. On the same day in Alexandria, 500 miles north, he measured the sun's angle about 7 degrees from vertical. Since 7 degrees is roughly 1/50th of a circle, he calculated Earth's circumference at about 25,000 miles, astonishingly close to the actual 24,900 miles. Think about what this required. Not just mathematical skill, but understanding that Earth is spherical, that the sun's rays arrive essentially parallel, that careful measurement of angles and distances can reveal cosmic truth. This was science in the modern sense: systematic observation, mathematical reasoning, testable conclusions. Aristarchus of Samos proposed that Earth revolves around the Sun, heliocentrism, 18 centuries before Copernicus. His idea was rejected by most ancient astronomers because it contradicted common sense and had no clear supporting evidence. But the fact that it was proposed at all shows the intellectual freedom and boldness of Hellenistic science. In medicine, Herophilus and Erasistratus, working in Alexandria, performed systematic dissections, possibly even vivisections of condemned criminals, according to hostile sources. They distinguished nerves from blood vessels, identified the brain as the organ of intelligence, and described the heart's function. Their anatomical discoveries would not be surpassed until the Renaissance. Literature flourished in new forms. Callimachus, a scholar-poet at the library, refined aesthetic principles valuing compression, erudition, and polish over epic length. His Aetia Causes explained origins of myths and customs in elegant verse. Apollonius of Rhodes wrote the Argonautica, retelling Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece, with psychological depth and romantic focus unusual in epic poetry. His depiction of Medea's conflicted love for Jason influenced Roman poets like Virgil. Theocritus invented pastoral poetry idylls, depicting shepherds singing in idealized countryside, a genre that would influence Virgil's eclogues and persist through Renaissance literature. Pastoral offered urban sophisticates an imagined escape to simpler rural life, a fantasy of peace and natural beauty contrasting with Hellenistic cities' complexity. The Hellenistic world was cosmopolitan, literally, world city, a place where ethnic and cultural boundaries blurred. In Alexandria, Greeks mingled with Egyptians, Jews, Phoenicians, Persians. In Antioch, capital of the Seleucid kingdom, Asian and Greek cultures merged. Greek remained the prestige language. Educated people across the empire spoke it, but local languages persisted. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, was produced in Alexandria for Greek-speaking Jews, creating the version of the Old Testament later used by Christians. Art evolved from classical ideals toward dramatic realism and emotional intensity. The Dying Gaul depicts a wounded Celtic warrior, muscles tensing, face grimacing, individualized portraiture of suffering rather than idealized heroism. The S. Laocoon group shows the Trojan priest and his sons being strangled by sea serpents, bodies twisting in agony, faces contorted in pain, Baroque complexity far from classical serenity. The Venus de Milo, goddess of love with missing arms, combines idealized beauty with human warmth, neither remote Olympian nor fully naturalistic but something between. Architecture became grander, more ornate. The Temple of Apollo at Didyma near Miletus was designed on colossal scale, with enormous columns intentionally left unfinished to impress visitors with sublime incompleteness. The altar of Zeus at Pergamum featured a frieze depicting gods battling giants, with figures nearly bursting from the stone in high relief. Divine power made almost overwhelming in its intensity. Philosophy continued evolving. The Academy and Lyceum persisted, but Epicureanism and Stoicism dominated Hellenistic thought. These philosophies traveled with Greek culture, spreading across the Mediterranean. Later, they would profoundly influence Rome, Lucretius wrote, on the nature of things expounding Epicurean physics and ethics, while Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius would articulate Stoic philosophy with clarity and power. Cynicism, founded by Diogenes of Sinope in the 4th century, flourished in Hellenistic cities. Cynics rejected conventional values, wealth, status, comfort, living in voluntary poverty to achieve freedom. Diogenes reportedly lived in a large ceramic jar, owned nothing, and insulted powerful people to demonstrate that virtue needed no external supports. When Alexander visited Diogenes and offered to grant any wish, Diogenes asked him to stop blocking the sunlight. Alexander reportedly said that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes, perhaps recognizing that the vagrant philosopher possessed a freedom that even world conquerors lacked. Skepticism, another Hellenistic philosophy, questioned whether knowledge was possible. Pyrrho of Elis argued that for every argument, an equal and opposite argument exists. Since we cannot determine truth with certainty, we should suspend judgment epoche and achieve ataraxia, tranquility, through recognizing the limits of knowledge. This philosophical skepticism would resurface in Renaissance and Enlightenment thought, challenging dogmatic certainty. These philosophies shared common features: focus on individual ethics rather than political theory, emphasis on achieving tranquility or flourishing in a world beyond individual control, universalism, transcending particular city-states. They were philosophies for cosmopolitan subjects of kingdoms, not for autonomous citizens of polis. The world had changed, and philosophy changed with it. The Hellenistic kingdoms were not Greek in the classical sense. Their rulers were Macedonian dynasties governing mixed populations, but they promoted Greek culture, founded Greek cities, supported Greek scholars and artists. Greek became the common language, Koine Greek, different from classical Attic, but mutually intelligible, spread across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. This cultural diffusion was Alexander's most lasting achievement. He destroyed the Persian Empire but replaced it with something unprecedented, a multicultural world united by Greek language and culture while maintaining local traditions. In Bactria, Greek rulers minted coins, with Greek inscriptions on one side and Indian script on the other. In Egypt, Ptolemies presented themselves as pharaohs to Egyptians and Greek kings to Greeks. Synthesis rather than replacement characterized Hellenistic culture. When Rome eventually conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms Macedon in 168 BC, Greece in 146 BC, Asia and Syria in the 1st century BC, and finally Egypt in 30 BC, they found Greek culture irresistible. Educated Romans learned Greek, read Greek literature, employed Greek tutors, collected Greek art, and adopted Greek philosophy. Horace famously wrote, "Captive Greece captured her savage conqueror and brought the arts to rustic Latium." Rome ruled politically, but Greek culture ruled intellectually. Through Rome, Greek culture spread further to Western Europe, to Britain, eventually worldwide. Greek language became the medium of the New Testament. Greek philosophy shaped Christian theology, Platonism influencing Augustine, Aristotelianism shaping Aquinas. Greek aesthetic ideals were revived in the Renaissance. Greek political concepts, democracy, citizenship, natural law influenced Enlightenment thought and modern political theory. Consider how far Greek culture traveled from its origins. From small city-states on the Aegean, perpetually quarreling, never politically unified, Greek language, thought, and art spread across the known world. The culture born in Athens, Sparta, and Corinth became the foundation of Western civilization and influenced the entire globe. This happened not through political power, Greece lost that, but through cultural excellence. The plays of Sophocles, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, the mathematics of Euclid, the epics of Homer, these proved more durable than any empire. They survived the fall of Polis, the conquest by Macedon, the rise and fall of Hellenistic kingdoms, the Roman conquest, Christianity's triumph, the fall of Rome itself, the Middle Ages, and emerged into modernity still vital, still relevant. Greek culture endured because it addressed permanent features of human experience. The questions Socrates asked, what is justice? What is virtue? How should we live? Remain our questions. The tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides explore dilemmas we still face. Greek architecture embodies proportions that still satisfy human aesthetic sense. Greek mathematics discovered truths that are truly eternal. Pythagorean theorem, Euclidean geometry, mathematical proof itself. The Greeks gave us tools for thinking, standards for beauty, questions about existence that each generation must answer anew. They showed that small communities of free citizens could produce culture of extraordinary richness. They demonstrated that human reason, properly applied, could understand nature and ourselves. They proved that democracy, for all its flaws, could create conditions for human excellence. They also showed civilization's fragility. Athens at its height lasted barely 50 years before war corrupted it. Alexander's empire fragmented immediately after his death. The Hellenistic kingdoms eventually fell to Rome. Nothing lasts forever. Power shifts. Empires rise and fall. What endures is culture ideas, art, values that speak across centuries to people who never knew the world that produced them. As you drift towards sleep, consider the remarkable journey we have traced. From Minoan palaces decorated with leaping dolphins, through Mycenaean citadels where bards sang of gods and heroes, across the Dark Ages when communities kept memories alive around fires, to Homer's crystallization of Greek identity in verse, through the Persian Wars where freedom defeated empire, to Athens's golden age of unparalleled achievement, through the tragedy of the Peloponnesian War, to philosophy's deepening in defeat. Finally, to Hellenistic diffusion across 3 continents. This is the story of a culture that refused to die, that adapted and evolved, that spread beyond its origins to shape human civilization itself. The ancient Greeks are gone. Their polis are ruins. Their kingdoms have vanished. Their empire dissolved 2,000 years ago. But when you read a play, study geometry, visit a museum, discuss ethics, participate in democracy, or simply ask difficult questions about life's meaning, you engage with their legacy. They live in every person who examines their life, who creates beauty, who questions authority, who believes that human excellence is possible and worth pursuing. That is the most relaxing fact about ancient Greece, that despite all the wars, all the suffering, all the mistakes and tragedies, something magnificent was created that no passage of time can destroy. The Greeks discovered truths about humanity that remain true. They asked questions we still cannot answer. They set standards we still admire. They proved that humans, in the right circumstances, can achieve greatness that echoes through millennia. Sleep well, knowing that 2,500 years ago, in a small corner of the Mediterranean, ordinary humans accomplished something extraordinary. They created a culture that became our culture, that taught us how to think, how to question, how to create beauty and seek truth. They gave us the very tools with which we understand them and ourselves. The Greeks may be ancient history, but their gifts remain eternally present, waiting for each new generation to discover them anew. As fresh and vital as when Socrates questioned in the Agora, as beautiful as when the Parthenon gleamed new under the Aegean sun, as profound as when Sophocles first asked how we should live in a world of suffering and uncertainty. That legacy, that eternal conversation between ancient wisdom and modern questions is the gift Greece gave humanity. And as long as humans wonder, question, create, and strive for excellence, the ancient Greeks will never truly be ancient. They will remain our contemporaries, our teachers, our inspiration. Rest now, in the knowledge that some things, truly, are timeless.